Hello and welcome to the Buffalo History Museum's M&T Third Friday program. My name is Matt Holland. I am the program and volunteer coordinator here. Tonight we have a pre-recorded presentation from Dr. Barbara Seals Nevergold, historian, activist, educator, and co-founder of the Uncrowned Queens Institute. She will be presenting on the Phyllis Wheatley Club. We hope you enjoy. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt, for that introduction. I want to thank also the Buffalo History Museum for the opportunity to talk about an organization and tell the story about an organization of African-American women who persisted through many trials and tribulations and made tremendous contributions to the African-American community and to the community at large in Buffalo. The Phyllis Wheatley Club. And still, they persisted. In 1999, I was introduced perhaps to an activity of the Phyllis Wheatley Club that I was not aware of. Now, this is about 100 years after the organization was founded. And at that point in 1999, I was part of an organization called the Women's Pavilion Pan Am 2001. We were planning a series of activities that were going to commemorate and celebrate the role that women played in the Pan American Exposition of 1901. And one of the members of that organization told me about a protest rally that had been held by a group of Black women. And I thought, wow, 1900, you had Black women that had the audacity to stage a protest rally. And so as we talked a little bit more about these women, and they are obviously the Phyllis Wheatley Club, we also talked about the fact that what they were doing was trying to advocate, or they were advocating, for the placement of the Negro exhibit at the Pan American Exposition. And at the time, that exhibit was in Paris at the Paris exhibition. So that sparked my interest and began my journey, I would say, to finding out more about this organization. Now, as I said, they were organizing in 1899, but they were an affiliate of a national organization that wasn't too much older, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. So let's talk a little bit about that organization, because it's important to understand the foundation for the Phyllis Wheatley Club being the NACW. The NACW really formed in 1896 in response to a public letter that was written by an individual by the name of James Jacks, a journalist who was the president of the Missouri Press Association. And Mr. Jacks wrote this letter that described African Americans as being liars and thieves, and the women especially as being prostitutes. You can imagine the uproar that caused within the Black community. I would also point out, before I go on to say a little bit more about that spark that ignited in the community and started the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, that Black women had been organizing even before emancipation, certainly in the North. Those free Black women were organizing and forming self-help groups that provided mutual aid, that provided assistance and benefits to the community. And they have been doing this for many years, as well as hosting cultural events for themselves and for the community. So they were not strangers at all to the club movement, but there was not a national organization until the National Federation of Afro-American Women, the National League of Colored Women, and the New Era Club came together to formulate the National Association of Women's Clubs. And you can see that their goal was broadly, again, to inform, educate, uplift, support, not just women, but through women's activities, the community, in the morality, the religious and social welfare of members of the community, and to protect the rights of women and children in the community, and to educate. They had as their motto, lifting as we climb, indicating that what they saw as the responsibility of women to, particularly those women who were more advantaged, to go back and to uplift other members of the race. And so this is how the Phyllis Wheatley Club then became part of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. In 1899, they formed in Buffalo, and they were the first affiliate of the NACW to form in Buffalo, although not the last one. There were several others. I found this photo of the Phyllis Wheatley Club in a newspaper in 1900, March of that year, as a matter of fact. And as you can see, the women posed for this photo, and they did so in what they called their clubhouse. And interestingly enough, their clubhouse was the Michigan Street Baptist Church. And so I have a photo of the church without the club members and with the club members. Also, I want to point out that in 1901, the population of Buffalo was 352,000 people at that point, with the African-American population being 1,698 thereabouts. And so for these women to form a club movement that had the strength of numbers for them, and at some point in 1900, they did not have 150 women, but shortly thereafter, somewhere a year later, they had 150 members in the organization, which is significant. And so they were able to wield, I think, a lot of influence with that number, even though the numbers of African Americans were fairly small. I have a photo too of Mary Talbert here. Mrs. Talbert is a legend. She's not as well known as she should be, I think, as a leader in movements. And we'll talk more about her leadership, but she was the first secretary of the Phyllis Wheatley Club in Buffalo. And as we talk about her and as we look at her accomplishments and her contributions, she was destined certainly to be a leader in the club movement and elsewhere. Technology. Okay, going forward. I just pulled this article from an October 28th newspaper, and this is just one of the newspapers featuring an announcement about the launch of the club on that date in 1899. And I think it's significant in that it shows sophistication of the women in recognizing that they needed to publicize what they were doing to get support for it. And so they became very adept at PR, making sure they got their activities publicized. Getting started, they may have launched in October 1899, but it was obvious that they really were already planning many, many activities, and they hit the ground running. Of course, first on their agenda was to invite the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs to hold its national convention in Buffalo during the Pan American Exposition. So they extended an invitation to the organization immediately to do that. They also advocated for inclusion in the Pan Am, not just for exhibits, but also for employment and other opportunities that they envisioned would come as a result of this World's Fair. They looked at education as, again, one of their major goals. And so they placed books by Black authors in libraries and schools. They organized what they called mothers clubs to teach parenting. They set up food drives and food giveaways, and didn't just limit it to the African-American poor in the community. They advocated for suffrage and This year is really critical in the suffrage movement, and that we're in 2020, we're celebrating the centennial of women getting the vote, but not all women got the vote in 1920. African-American women didn't get the vote. Nonetheless, these women persisted in supporting suffrage for women, and they wanted also suffrage for men. So that came later, of course, for African-Americans. And they also began fundraising efforts because they had a plan to create and develop a settlement home. So here we have the outside of their clubhouse, the Michigan Street Baptist Church. And this is about how it looked at that time. And as I said, you know, the advocacy for inclusion in activities in the Pan Am started just about when the group started in 1899. But by the next year, they didn't see the progress and the success they wanted. And so they decided that they were going to launch a protest rally. And again, that was a bold move, an audacious move for Black women at that time, probably any women at that time, but they did so. And while their goal was to get engagement and to get the Negro exhibit brought to the fair, and that exhibit really was important, was critical in that it showed progress that African Americans had made since emancipation. In 1900, what the women were saying was that there were only 2 exhibits that were coming to the fair for sure, representing African Americans, and both were pejorative or did not certainly show African American progress. One was the old plantation and the other was Darkest Africa. Both exhibits on the Midway, where a great number of people would see them. Over 8 million people came to the Pan American Exposition, and I would bet close to 8 million people went to the Midway. These exhibits were exhibits that were peopled, I would say by people. In other words, there were inhabitants and residents that lived in these exhibits. On the old plantation, they had log cabins. They also had theaters in both of these exhibits where the individuals who were housed in the exhibits did shows, dances, either of the slave dances or of the savage dances were done. They also had souvenir shops where they made implements and sold them to people. The old plantation even had a cotton field. Can you imagine a cotton field in Buffalo? But they did. And so these were considered to be reflections of African Americans at some point in history, but again, they were not reflective of where African Americans were in 1900. And so this is where the protest rally comes into play, and where Mary Talbert, as the spokesperson for the Phyllis Wheatley Club, gave a presentation which she entitled, "Why the Afro-American Should Be Represented at the Pan Am Expo." Now, unfortunately, this presentation has been lost to history. We don't have a copy of it. Newspaper accounts citing the protest rally and talking about a little bit about Mrs. Talbert's remarks indicated that she certainly said, detailed, quote, what she considered to be the essential requisites of such an exhibit. And I think she entitled the presentation the way she did because in 1893, there was another protest that went on at the Columbia World's Fair, World's Exposition in Chicago at that point. And that protest resulted in a pamphlet produced by Ida B. Wells, which was the reason why the colored American is not at the Columbian World's Fair. Again, the World's Fairs and the ways in which African Americans responded to them were part of a national movement because African Americans realized, one, that as a result of being engaged in these fairs, they would be able to present a positive picture, an image of the accomplishments of African Americans since being freed from slavery. And also they should be able to benefit in the benefits or the financial and social benefits of the fair. And so they were very adamant, and expos were very frequently held throughout the century. I should also point out, again, and I kind of went past her name, but there were only two other speakers at this protest rally. One being Mrs. A.D. Wilson, who was the president of the Women's Temperance Union. And again, this speaks to the ways in which the Phyllis Wheatley Club reached out to collaborate with other women's organizations, particularly white women's organizations, and to get support from them and to support them in turn. And so Mrs. Wilson is seen at, quite frankly, several events that the organization did and that she supported and gave them, I think, larger credence in the general community. The other speaker was an interesting individual by the name of James A. Ross, who was an attorney, although he didn't practice too much law because he was engaged in any number of careers, but he was a Democratic politician, which was quite unusual at that point since most African Americans were Republican. But Mr. Ross was even at one time considered to be assigned to be the diplomat in Haiti. And he was working with the administration of the President Grover Cleveland at that time. For some reason, he declined the appointment, but he was very active nationally in Democratic politics. He also had an idea and a goal and a desire to be the Negro exhibit manager. And through the years, there's been some confusion and secrecy around not only whether or not Mr. Ross was the manager, but whether or not the exhibit itself actually came to Buffalo. That was part of my conversation with the Women's Pavilion colleague who first told me about the protest rally and first talked about the Negro exhibit and some question as to whether or not that exhibit really existed. So again, it's kind of part of the mystery that intrigued me about the Pan Am and the role that the Phyllis Wheatley Club played in the Pan Am. As you can see, I've listed some other things here that Mr. Ross did. He was an editor and a publisher of a number of newspapers, including the Globe and Freeman, which interestingly enough, published the pamphlet which accompanied the Negro exhibit at the Pan American Exposition. And that pamphlet itself was also interesting in that it was the only one that had paid advertising in it. Thanks, I think, to Mr. Ross. But Mr. Ross also defended James B. Parker, the McKinley assassination hero, and even hired Mr. Parker to be a salesman for another newspaper that he published called the Gazetteer and Guide. And I'll say one thing more about Mr. Parker before moving on. I have a picture here of his cigar store. So again, he was an entrepreneur, and this photo was actually one of the pictures in the Negro exhibit, which displayed the businesses that African Americans owned. All right, so the women held the protest rally, and it was successful. In December, they found out that the fair had agreed, the fair managers had agreed to bring the Negro exhibit to Buffalo for the Pan American Exposition. So they didn't rest on their laurels, though. They continued, I think, to develop, again, for the community, a sense that African Americans had more accomplishments and contributions than the old plantation or darkest Africa were going to show them when they went to the fair. So they developed a pageant, which they put on April 19th, 1901, which was actually about 2 weeks before the fair was to open, because the exposition was opening on May 1st. And 30 Years of Freedom was a pageant, as I said, that was organized by the Phyllis Wheatley Club. There were 3 narrators who introduced each of the acts in the play. Edward Crosby, who was the first journalist hired by the Buffalo Times, first African-American journalist hired by the Buffalo Times newspaper, Mary Talbert, again, and Reverend J. Edward Nash, who was the longtime pastor of the Michigan Street Baptist Church. The women of the Phyllis Wheatley Club, again, reached out to women in the community, particularly the socially elite women, who could help support them financially, and asked them to be honorary chairs of this event. It was a fundraising event to raise monies also for the settlement home. And according to the newspapers, it was quite successful. It had between 1,500 and 2,000 individuals attend, mostly white individuals, and as the newspaper said, some better class of the race. They raised about $500. I'm not sure what that translates to in 2020 dollars, but I suspect it was a hefty sum. Again, using their PR, the women got wonderful coverage in the newspapers about the play and about the cause that this play was supporting. As I said, it was a 3-act production with 8 scenes. It was a cast of 200 men, women, and children who performed in this play. The acts were, as described here, slavery, freedom, education. So in a sense, again, they were laying out the case for the progression of African-American accomplishment and achievement, and they did so by a musical. I love this quote, and I'm sure that the organizers loved it too, in that the newspaper said, "The entertainment opened the eyes of the white folk who saw it. They had no idea that persons of such talent could be found among the colored population of Buffalo." That was in the Express on the 20th. As I said, the Phyllis Wheatley Club was successful in bringing the Negro exhibit to Buffalo, the award-winning exhibit, and received 17 gold medals in Paris. It was coordinated or curated by W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Mr. Du Bois did not come to Buffalo with the exhibit, but he did send the curator from the government, Mr. Callahan, who we see there seated. I'm not sure if he's the one who's seated or standing. The other individual, I believe, is Mr. Ross. We don't have exact confirmation of that, but the exhibit itself, again, featured through displays, through photographs, through scrapbooks, through all kinds of exhibits of artistic and artistic work, sculptural work by African Americans. It was placed in the Liberal Arts Building. So as compared to the Darkest Africa and the old plantation, it was not readily available or seen. It was also made smaller, was given a smaller footprint than the exhibit in Paris. The Paris exhibit actually had been supported by the federal government, who gave Du Bois $15,000 in order to put this on. So as I said, it was a major achievement for the women nonetheless in being able to get the exhibit here. And again, I know that they promoted it as much as they promoted everything that they did. The pamphlet that was produced by Mr. Ross and his newspaper, as I said, for some time was in doubt as to whether or not the Negro exhibit was actually in Buffalo because of its placement and all the controversy associated with it. And this is a story, a publication put out by the Buffalo and Erie County Library, which actually has the original pamphlet in scrapbook that has all the pamphlets and publications from the Pan Am. And as the community was getting ready to celebrate the centennial of the Pan Am, this publication was produced that verified the placement of the exhibit, the curator of the exhibit, the ads that were placed, and the fact that the pamphlet was also unusual and that it lists some Buffalo residents, it lists leading Black journals and journalists. Of course, since Mr. Ross was a journalist, he would of course make sure that his publications were there. And there were several personal messages from Mr. Ross that were part of this pamphlet, and quite an extraordinary and significant find. And if you ever have an opportunity to get the publication that was done by the library, it certainly is worth taking a look at. All right, so the women were successful in getting the Negro exhibit into Buffalo, but of course they didn't rest on their laurels there. As I said, they had another goal, and that was to get the conference here of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which they again were able to do from July 7th to the 11th. They met in Buffalo, and this is the lovely Mary Church Terrell, and she was the president of the organization at that point, the very first president. She was stepping down and a new president was being elected. This conference was attended by a number of nationally known prominent women who were all part of the NACW. Mrs. Booker T. Washington, for one, Mrs. Blanche K. Bruce, the widow of one of the first Black representatives in US Congress, Mrs. Rosetta Sprague, who was the daughter of Frederick Douglass. There were 250 delegates and guests who came to this conference, to this convention, and of course that infused Buffalo and the fair with finances. They were welcomed by Mayor Kennedy of Buffalo. As I said, generated a lot of publicity, and they were about their business of working on making sure that they, throughout the country, coordinated their activities to improve the lives of African Americans and to generate positive imagery of African American accomplishment. They also had sessions where the issues that were primary importance to them were highlighted. The convict lease system, lynching, kindergarten education, parenting. These were all areas on which programs were to be developed. Mary Talbert, his presentation was on reasons for placing correct literature before our children. So again, she was involved with Phyllis Wheatley Club, and we find later that she becomes a very integral part of the national organization as well. African Americans in Buffalo did not stop with, again, advocating for the Negro exhibit or advocating for the conference to come. They were involved and engaged in a lot of entrepreneurial efforts. As a matter of fact, there was a group formed in which they wanted to build a hotel that would be owned and operated by African Americans. And Mr. Ross was involved in that endeavor. But they also got the Board of Managers to organize or to formulate what they called a Committee of Comfort. And the Committee of Comfort was charged with reaching out to African Americans nationally. They sent out letters to Black newspapers throughout the country, inviting African Americans to the fair, ensuring them that they would be welcome, ensuring them that they would not be discriminated against, which were some problems that were that they encountered at other fairs, and really worked within the community as well to identify African Americans who would provide housing to visitors when they came in. And the housing wasn't to be free. They were actually renting out to visitors to ensure that there was a broad spectrum and base of homes, of residences and hotels and boarding homes where African American visitors could be welcomed during their stay here in the city for the expo. There were members of the community who bought Pan Am stock. Unfortunately, the Pan Am wasn't financially successful, but at that time, they thought it would be. And the stock was not cheap. It was $10 a stock. And so there were members, however, that were able to invest in the fair, and they did that. They also hosted welcoming parties, again, trying to encourage and to support African Americans who were visiting the city to ensure that they had a good time, to ensure that they felt welcome to the city. So what was the impact of the African American protest? I think it started with the protest, but certainly, as I indicated, community-wide, there were many activities and many groups who came together, worked with the Phyllis Wheatley Club, worked independently to ensure that African Americans had a place in the Pan American Exposition. We had the successful placement of the Negro exhibit, which is a testament to the results of their advocacy. I just mentioned the Committee of Comfort. Albert Thomas, who also was an attorney, actually he was a Yale graduate and a graduate of Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. And he was appointed to the Bureau of Information, and he was the highest appointee in the African American community to work at the fair. There were some other jobs, certainly, that African Americans got as a result of the fair business. After all, James Parker, the African American involved in the McKinley assassination, we call him the hero, was a waiter at the fair. I think a major part of what the women did was to ignore the degrading exhibits. In other words, they did not just, they focused on the positives of the Negro exhibit, and they downgraded essentially, any attention being paid to the degrading exhibits of the darkest Africa and the oil plantation. Their activities and their work established the Phyllis Wheatley Club as a strong advocacy group in the city. And I believe it prepared the community for the Niagara Movement, which we'll talk about in a minute. I mentioned James Benjamin Parker because certainly you can't talk about the Pan American Exposition without talking about or thinking about the fact that President McKinley was assassinated at that convention, and that his assassination by Leon Czarglos was interrupted by a man by the name of James Parker, an African-American man who prevented Czarglos from firing the third bullet at McKinley and killing him instantly. However, great controversy occurred around Mr. Parker's acts. He was declared a hero until such time as he was not declared a hero. There's another 100-year-old plus mystery that has continued to really accompany the history of the Pan American Exposition. Mr. Parker's story deserves a presentation of its own, and I hope to do that at another time. But we don't want to forget that he had an important role to play at the Pan Am, and when he was discredited by some who felt that he had not actually prevented the assassin from firing a third bullet, the African American community as a whole were outraged. They were incensed. Nationwide, they were incensed, and there was a lot of work to help to Mr. Parker to tell his story. Ultimately, Mr. Ross stepped in at one point and tried to help Mr. Parker to tell his part of his side of the story and to vindicate him from the backlash he received from people who said he was lying. When Mr. Parker left town, he left to work as a salesman, a traveling salesman for one of the papers that Mr. Ross produced. And as I said, that's a whole nother story. Okay, so following their activities in 1901, as I said, these women did not rest on their laurels. They continued to push forward. They continued to work for what they believed was important. And the Michigan Street Baptist Church continued to be a central focus point for their meetings and for their activities. In 1902, they again came to the forefront in another protest in which they protested the fact that they did not believe the police were doing their job. The area between Michigan and Oak Street and Broadway and William Street in Buffalo was a red light district. And that's exactly the area where the church is located. Mrs. Talbert lived next door to the church. Mr. Ross lived on the other side of the church. So they certainly had a vested interest in making sure that the red light district, the prostitutes that were in this district, the gambling that went on in houses of ill repute were addressed by the police. They again protested police inaction and actually an agreement that the police had made with the Anti-Saloon League to essentially look the other way as these houses of ill repute were operating. They collaborated, again, with white women's groups, and resolution that came from that resulted in the police retracting their stance in the way in which they enforce the law in the red light district, and so that district could be cleaned up. I mentioned a little bit earlier that I thought one of the impacts of the women's activities in the Pan Am contributed to the fact that the Niagara Movement took place in Western New York just a few years later. The fact that the women were successful in their protests, the fact that they had a voice, that they made a voice for themselves, and that they could be seen, or Buffalo, certainly as a community, could be seen as a community that for African Americans was one that could speak up for itself, that could take the bold moves of protesting actions and activities that they saw as unjust and discriminatory. In 1905, W.B. Du Bois called together a meeting of men. There were about 40, but only about 29 came to Western New York for what he called the Niagara Movement. And that movement took place, or those meetings took place from July 11th to the 13th. There were a number of reasons, other reasons why Du Bois came to Western New York. An Elks Convention was being held at that time, and the cost of a train ticket was extremely low. And so this was a benefit for men traveling from all over the country to come to Western New York. Buffalo was the center for the second largest, or second busiest, certainly, railroad center in the nation. That was a reason why so many people came to the Pan American, because it was easy to get here and it was inexpensive to get here. But Du Bois also reached out to Mrs. Talbert's husband, and probably to Mrs. Talbert too, to help him to get accommodations for this meeting. And not accommodations in Buffalo necessarily, but accommodations where the men would have plenty of room to deliberate, but also they wanted room to be able to rest and to be able to have activities, fun activities during their in between the times that they were deliberating and planning the Niagara Movement. And so they contacted Mrs. Talbert's believed, Mr. Talbert, certainly Mr. Talbot, or there's a letter that was written to him by Du Bois. And they actually had the first meeting at the Niagara Movement at 521 Michigan Street, the home of Mary and William Talbert. The members of the Niagara Movement had a vision and had a philosophy that was contrary to Booker T. Washington's. And so there's a major debate that was going on between Du Bois and Washington about what African Americans should do about discrimination and about their rights in this country. Du Bois wanted to advocate for social, civic, political rights immediately. And Washington wanted African Americans to concentrate on self-help and on preparation, education and preparation for the workforce as primary, and not to concentrate on issues of equality in politics or in social equality. So this divide between the two men was quite prominent for a period of time, and Washington did not support the Niagara Movement. The Niagara Movement was essentially the forerunner of the NAACP, and it existed for about 5 years before it dissolved, but nonetheless it laid the basis for the modern civil rights movement and the NAACP, and had strong connections to Western New York, to individuals in the Western New York community, and certainly, I believe, to the Talberts. And as you can see here, from the Pan Am protest to the Niagara Movement, there is a connection. The first year that the Niagara Movement met, though, the organizational year in 1905, was not open to women. It was only open to men. And so the question is, where were the women while the men were meeting? Because very often in the historical writings about the founding of this movement, Mary Talbert is mentioned as a founder of the Niagara Movement. And as I said, that is questionable, again, because women were not invited to join in 1905, even though the group met at Mary Talbert's home. The women, including Mary Talbert, were having their own meeting. The Phyllis Wheatley Club and other clubs that were formulated as part of the National Association of Women's Clubs began to organize in statewide or in regional groups And in 1905, the Western New York Federated Women's Clubs, a regional group, met in Buffalo. Mrs. Booker T. Washington was in attendance at that meeting, as was Mrs. Hester Jerome Jeffrey, who attended the first meeting of the Phyllis Wheatley Club and was a national organizer for the NACW. So the women were engaged at the same time that the Niagara Movement was meeting. The women were engaged in their own activities. Again, moving forward the mission of the organization of the NACW and the Phyllis Wheatley Club. And also, by this time, in 1905, the Phyllis Wheatley Club had actually opened up their settlement home. And they were introducing their sisters from throughout Western New York and other clubs to the settlement home that they had on Potter Street. Potter Street, it now is Nash Street, where the Nash home is located. Again, the Nash home was the residence of the pastor of the Michigan Street Baptist Church, Reverend J. Edward Nash. That home offered already at this point in 1905 classes for sewing classes for young ladies. As you can see, even though they had a small group of young ladies at that point, they were active. And of course, they had plans to grow. Mrs. Susan Evans, who was the first president of the Phyllis Wheatley Club, was a social worker, and she was charged with the development of the settlement home. She also was a officer of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, having been elected at the 1901 convention as one of the corresponding secretaries for the organization. You've seen Mary B. Talbert throughout this presentation because she's a significant leader in the women's club movement. Mrs. Talbert was born in Oberlin, Ohio. She was a graduate of Oberlin University, or Oberlin College at the time. And she graduated, she was 19 years old. She was an educator who went to teach in schools in Arkansas, and very shortly after became the vice principal of a high school in Arkansas, the first African-American woman to hold that role. She married Mr. William H. Talbert in 1891, moved to Buffalo, became a member of the Michigan Street Baptist Church, and as I said, one of the founding members of the Phyllis Wheatley Club. And there's much more to be said about Mrs. Talbert, and much is being written about her and about her life. But suffice it to say that this is a woman who had major leadership roles in so many of the issues and so many of the activist areas that African Americans were involved in during the period of time that she lived. Unfortunately, she died at the age of 57 in 1923, and much of the writings and the papers that she's done are not available. They weren't preserved. And I found this photo in another 1900 newspaper, and it was quite intriguing to me. Certainly, again, organizations like the Phyllis Wheatley Club were very focused on young people and the education of young people, and more than likely would have been involved in this group of young women called the Oriole Circlet of Buffalo. Just a gorgeous picture, but unfortunately not anything else about this group. I believe the young women were named. None of the names were particularly known to me, but I hold out that as I do research, that at some point I'm going to find out more information about them. But again, an example of the fact that African Americans were at the turn of the century, 1900, in Buffalo, Western New York, and elsewhere, and earlier, certainly focused on ways in which they could uplift themselves and reach out and help each other. Finally, the Phyllis Wheatley Club survived or thrived and contributed to this community for nearly 100 years. I have a photo of this young woman here, Mrs. Mary Crosby Chappell, who was a member of the organization. Mrs. Chappell died in 2006, and she was 100 years old at the time of her death. She was an educator. She was a journalist. She was a civil rights activist. She was a powerhouse in this community, and a woman who I think exemplifies for me certainly what the Phyllis Wheatley Club women did in persisting and working through struggles in order to improve and assist members of this community. When in 1999, I began to learn about the Phyllis Wheatley Club and about the women in the Phyllis Wheatley Club, tried to find out as much as I could about women, individual women who were part of the organization. And that helped me to develop, along with my colleague, an organization. Started out as a project of the Women's Pavilion, but an organization called the Uncrowned Queens Institute. And the Institute's goal is to research, collect, preserve, and share the biographical histories of African-American women, and as well as African-American men in this community. Because like the Phyllis Wheatley Club and its activities, so much of that information is not well known. So much of it has not been documented and preserved. And so much of it is educational and inspirational information that young people should know and young people should learn about. There are many people in this community who have contributed in ways unknown, in ways large and small, in ways that are all important. And so when we talk to people about what the Uncrowned Queens is about and who it is we're trying to document, these are some of the ways, or some of the characteristics or descriptors of Uncrowned Queens and who they are and why they are important and why we work to preserve their histories and to make them accessible on a webpage that we call Uncrowned Community Builders. The Builders webpage is one that has taken the biographies, the histories of the queens, and combined them with histories of uncrowned kings. And so together, those individuals now are part of the project of the Uncrowned Queens Institute called the Uncrowned Community Builders. I have enjoyed sharing this information today about the Phyllis Wheatley Club, about their activities during the Pan American Exposition and throughout their first decade, about the ways in which this organization persisted throughout almost a century in this community, and hopefully to share this information with people who weren't aware of this dynamic organization that holds a place in history, in the history of Buffalo, that is significant and that should be known broadly by the community. So thank you for being part of this today. I hope that you will feel free to contact me if you like at bnevergold@gmail.com. I'd love to continue the conversation on James Parker and possibly on James Ross as well. Again, individuals whose history is intricately entwined with Buffalo's history. Just to leave one last thought, say that one of the goals of the Uncrowned Queens Institute is to have the community